Good evening, everyone. My name is Renee Littleton, and I am the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications here at Arena Stage, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to our sixth Civil Dialogue this evening. By a show of hands, how many of you have been to a Civil Dialogue before? Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we love to see familiar faces. Thank you for coming, and for the first-timers here, welcome again. The Civil Dialogues program is led by and created Professor Amitai Eredzoni, and we are so pleased with this collaboration. The dialogues are an opportunity to have open discussion about issues that are affecting us today, current issues that are happening. Before we begin, and before you all get to the juiciness of today's dialogue, exploring well-being in the digital age, I've been asked to read an excerpt from John Perry Barlow's A Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace from 1976. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one, so I address you with no greater authority than that with which liberty itself always speaks. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. You claim there are problems among us that you need to solve. You use this claim as an excuse to invade our precincts. Many of these problems don't exist. Where there are real conflicts, where there are wrongs, we will identify them and address them by our means. We are forming our own social contract. This governance will arise according to the conditions of our world, not yours. Our world is different. Without further ado, Professor Amitai Eredzoni and our panel of guests tonight.
Thank you very, very much. Indeed, it's a pleasure to work with you and the other staff and colleagues. We have been. Our last one was about a meeting between Trump supporters and Trump critics, and you see the stage is still in one piece, so it all was very, very civil. So I very much appreciate you reading this Declaration of Independence, which was issued in 1996. That's not that long ago, a little more, like 20 years. At that time, the idea was, and Barlow just captured, I think, quite well, that the internet is going to be this wonderful harmonic village in which things will self-regulate, take care of themselves, and all we need to do is keep bad government out, and everything is going to be hunky-dory. Today, I think many of us believe that at least it became a city, and some of us fear a jungle, where we have a large variety of problems, from cyberbullying to foreigners using Facebook and Google to try to manipulate our election, to some people feel people lose connectiveness to each other, children get addicted to the screens, and ever more problems. And the question for us tonight is what is the nature of these problems and how can we deal with them? It seems just leaving internet alone, not all of us feel any more comfortable. I'd just like to add one more comment and then I'll turn to my colleagues. In effect, you think about it as a case study in a much larger problem. And that throughout modernization, what happens again, that some engineers and scientists or entrepreneurs come up with a new technology and they introduce it into social society, and we need to adapt. There's no committee meetings which asks, do we want to have that new thing? Is it morally ethical or socially productive? We're going to have a future session on bioengineering, which people talk about engineering our futures or our babies. There's no committee or commission or congressional or anybody who is asked the question, do we want that? Technology marches on, and we forever try to catch up. Our moral and political institutions are ever lagging. So from my viewpoint at least, the issue in front of us is a typical case study. It won't happen when you have a new technology and we somehow have to come to terms with whatever it jumps on us. So the answer reminds me of a story about a couple who went to a rabbi and asked the rabbi to settle a dispute. So the rabbi first called in the husband made his case, and the rabbi said, you're absolutely right. Then he called in the wife, and the wife made her case, and the rabbi said, you're absolutely right. So when the wife of the rabbi heard that, she was indignant, and she said, how can you do that? How can you say both the wife and the husband is right? And he said, you know what, you're also right. That reminds me, when we talk about should it be government regulation, should it be self-regulated, should it be third parties, should it be the parents, that's our subject. We have a tradition of not introducing the speakers. You have their bios in your programs. Originally, we were going to go through 4 questions, but to leave more time for discussion, we're going to group them into 2 groups. So our first question for the panel is there a problem? How serious is the problem? What is the nature of a problem we face in cyberspace, and what do you think we should do about it?
Okay, I'll try to be very quick. But thank you so much, Amitai, for putting this together, and all of you for coming. As far as challenges, there are so many to choose from. I'd like to talk just for a minute about a challenge that I see potentially underlying many of the in-our-faces, on fire, wildfire type problems that you mentioned, from cyberbullying to the fake news. And that is to do with cognition. I just want to think a little bit about how this habitat is changing us in ways that we do not perhaps know, or that we're only beginning to wake up to. In other words, unintended consequences that have been perhaps invisible until now. And just to start, it's really important to understand, or to basically be aware of how technology so quickly has changed from a box that we had to walk across the room to click on to enter and exit. And now it's a habitat. We're dealing with things that think, and the privacy issues. We're dealing with, sneakers that monitor us. We're dealing with Alexa and Siri and toddlers who think that they're playmates, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's our ether, it's our habitat, and therefore any animal in a certain habitat is going to be affected and shaped. And what concerns me is the changing in what it means to know, how we're creating knowledge, how we're creating meaning making. Just for instance, some recent research has been looking at what happens when we search online. And it's something that happens all the time. And the instantaneity is so at the forefront of this process. We get an answer before we even finish answering a question. And the new research is showing that, first of all, people, after just Googling or searching online very briefly, actually they have a significantly less willingness to wrestle with a complex problem later. Their quote-unquote need for cognition drops. That's very interesting. And as well, a little bit of Googling online, and they become very willing to overestimate what they know, even if the time online didn't reap a correct or any answer at all. People overestimate then what they can do without the machine. So I think that this is these sorts of studies are actually reflected in how people are operating. We tend to, most of the time, we tend to take exactly what comes up first in our searches. Most people don't flip to the second page of search results. And most Americans in studies, shockingly as it might be, still trust what they find online. And today, according to OECD measures, comparing Americans' ability to solve problems in a digital sphere, we're woefully below most developed countries. Information literacy tells us the same thing. So I think that, can we consider that what we know is changing to be something quick, easy, packaged, downloadable, and what does that mean about how we're making knowledge? And of course, this is occurring against the backdrop of a more manipulative, algorithmic, robotic kind of context. I'll just throw out two very quick other components of the context in which this changing knowledge seeking is occurring. One is the context is splintered, that kind of multitasking that undercuts our ability to deliberate. It's also, it's a silent phone now on the table undercuts fluid reasoning, ability to grapple with a problem. So these are kind of, I think, issues behind the headlines and something that really needs to be watched and something that has everything to do with well-being. So as far as a solution, well, that's a tall order. I mean, I'm talking about cultural, intellectual things. But I would just throw out a couple. One is on the user end. The other is on the inventor end. What the one solution I would say, and there's so much more we can do, but one very major solution, I think, is a missed opportunity. In this country, we've been woefully ineffective despite throwing more resources at the issue of information literacy or digital literacy. This is something that's really been talked about, really been studied from kindergarten on into higher education, and basically it's been very ineffective so far. And a lot now, in some universities, librarians, technologists are kind of waking up to the idea that what has the main research and teaching has been related to sources. So, kids are being taught, and they also gravitate toward finding and listing and stacking, sourcing together, when really the evaluation, which is where we score so poorly in international studies, is not being taught. And that's a grave missed opportunity. Even something as little as changing the language, from finding sources in research to learning about a topic shifts the way students actually approach. It reinstalls the curiosity that's being lost. And just secondly, very quickly, I'd say that accountability on the part of inventors, the technologists themselves, is finally something that's being woken up to. The IEEE, the largest trade association in the world related to technology, is now floating standards for creating ethical design in AI and robotics. This is really important. You can Google it and make a public comment yourself. Ethically aligned design, and their standards and their calls are saying, let's halt the disassociation from the social impact of our inventions. So I think on that score, and I could say a lot more about that, but I've heard for so many years about private qualms about technologists who are building devices that affect our health, affect our minds. And I think finally we're maybe getting a little bit of traction on that. There's so much more I think I could say. I didn't even touch on regulation. But I think that this is the ethical, deliberative, thinking and understanding and more metacognitive perspective on what thinking is today is a really important challenge for us to face.
I'll jump in right there and say, yes, I do think that government regulation is needed in this space. It's an issue of safety, and we found that in other areas, when safety is the critical factor, that we can't just depend on the industries themselves, the inventors, those that are making money off of it, and most certainly the users. We can't depend on all of those three somehow magically working in concert to make sure that they're all looking out for every consumer that ends up using the product and exists within the ecosystem. It certainly didn't happen when we were talking about electricity. It didn't happen when we're talking about building safety. It didn't happen when we're talking about automobiles. It wasn't that long ago when safety was just a luxury item, and it really took acts of Congress to get that turned around. And wouldn't you know it, the industry responded and figured out a way to sell safety as a feature. And that is something that I believe, well, we've had decades of car buyers accustomed to looking at safety aspects of the vehicle to help determine whether or not they were going to make that purchase and be satisfied with that purchase and recognize the value of it every day. Now, I don't think people are driving around praising their airbag that hasn't gone off, but when you find someone who has been involved in a collision and the features of the vehicle that have contributed to saving their lives have kicked in, they are certainly hyper aware of it and then thankful that those features were there. We don't have that safety net when it comes to our social interactions online. And then thinking a little bit further back in time when it comes to just humans and culture, I believe it's a little bit more nuanced to say that we're addicted to screens. I believe it really goes back to humans are addicted to stories. I mean, that's what it comes down to, whether it be sitting around the fire several millennia ago, or reading books, or listening to radio, or watching TV, or now on our phones. We as humans are just addicted to really good stories. And now, as it turns out, we have access to so many more good stories that why wouldn't we want to seek that out? Why wouldn't we want to fill all the time that we can with these stories? I think it's interesting, we tend to have more free time. Historically, we were very accustomed to working long hours from the time that the sun came up until the time that the sun went down. But now our sense of time and space has been stretched out a little bit more. We have lighting, and we have these moments in our day where we can fill them in microscopic increments. You can pull out your phone and just check it for 10 seconds, 15 seconds at a time, and get that quick hit of a story. And so I think that it takes some retooling to really consider what does it mean to participate when we as individuals have so much control over how we fill our time, how we fill our space. And I don't necessarily blame the inventors, the technologists, for creating something that meets a need that it seems that we all have as individuals. But I certainly will say that absent a more full dialogue that encompasses millions of people, it's up to government to regulate and build these guardrails, build these safety nets to make sure that there is a safe place to act to limit the amount of damage that is happening to us as a culture while we discuss how it is we want to interact with having this hyperconnectivity of having these small screens, having these large screens, and having the kind of connectivity that we're just not accustomed to having. We don't have the tools as individuals, and I'm not quite sure that parents have the understanding and the tools necessary to be able to pass on good behavior because everybody is learning at once. So you really don't have the expertise. You don't have that history of growing up with it and being able to pass on some of these cautionary tales as stories to the next generation. I would say that we probably need to look to the younger generation who are more accustomed to it to help teach everyone. So that should be a real tip-off that we all need to be educated. We all need to have access to better tools. And until we do have that dialogue, until we create those tools and have access to those tools, it is the role of government to step in and say, no, we need to set these boundaries. I think a good example of that would be baseline privacy legislation at the federal level. So to really place a value on individuals' privacy, give them some level of ownership and buy-in and what happens to the data about themselves, and more importantly, how that data interacts with the data about those in their community, whether it be on a small scale or even on a macro scale, and then provide them tools within the applications and services that they use so they can exercise some agency about it. Because the way that it stands now, it's basically a tragedy of the commons, where no one feels like they have power over the information about them that is out there being leveraged by other companies and services. And even if they did, I don't think that they have an understanding of how they can change the settings within their apps to really restrict or even expand how that data is used.
Before we move on, I just want to mention one statistics which casts some light on what you just said about security. Long before there was cyberspace, somebody compared how much it costs to save a life by using seat belts, which are required by the government, compared to how much it costs to save a life for driver education. And they found that driver education costs 43 times more than a seatbelt. So it suggests that sometimes, at least, there is a room for government intervention.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for putting this together. I guess in the same theme of government regulation, I want to focus on one area where I do think we need government intervention, and I think that that's controlling access to data. I very much believe that information is power, right? If we think about our phones or our computers today, if somebody had my phone, they could probably tell you what time I woke up, they could probably tell you when I went for a run, who my friends are, my family, my love interests. They could tell you what I did for work, some of my thoughts, very, extremely intimate aspects of my life. And I think that our laws haven't caught up with recognizing that this isn't information that should pass, whether it's to a government or to a private entity, that it's not information that should be shared without really strict controls. And I'll give you examples. I think that right now, our laws that govern when, for example, the police can access your information are outdated. They were written before people even widely use cell phones and widely use the internet. We have a national security agency that collects billions upon billions of pieces of data points. I think in one of the leaked documents, there was programs where the government collected information about every single phone call in and out of the Bahamas, for example. And unfortunately, I think our laws haven't caught up to where we as individuals feel information is sensitive and private, right? Most of us think the time we turn on our phone, the time we log into a Facebook account, where we might be at any given moment, that's all extremely sensitive. Our laws don't always protect that from law enforcement and from the government by requiring a warrant or requiring other high standards. And I say that it's important not just because privacy is important in the abstract, but because historically, often information can be used and targeted against those that were most disadvantaged. So when we look at, in the 60s, Martin Luther King Jr. was famously considered a quote-unquote national security threat and was surveilled by the government. Same with war protesters. Today, when we find out more and more information about local law enforcement surveillance, we see them tracking Twitter, things like Black Lives Matter protesters, other activists. And even, I think, abroad, when we see activists and protesters trying to organize to reform abuses in government, we often see efforts to tamp down on them, to get information, to find out where they live, to target them in other ways. And so I think that, in order to really sustain activism, to preserve the First Amendment, to make sure that all of these things in our society that are important for us to have functioning democracies, to make sure all of those things survive the internet, we very much have to control how the government can get this information to make sure it's only in narrow circumstances when appropriate. And I think part and parcel of that is also, as Maurice has already touched on, understanding when private entities should be able to get that information. Often private entities may not have the same power as the government, but they impact quite a lot. Facebook can tell you, if Facebook is going to influence what job advertisements you see, what housing advertisements you see. They can influence your buying choices. And I think that, we as consumers don't really understand how that data can have a very real impact on our life, and there's not yet the regulation to make sure that we are really in control of it and it doesn't pass to whether it's the government or private actors without the right safeguards.
So we started with the John Perry Barlow quote, and I think many of us sort of snickered at that, and it seemed so kind of antique. But the internet that he was imagining was a non-commercial network, and the world that he was coming out of, it was a very homogeneous group of geeks that were building it. And I think if we look at the internet today and the through line from 20 years ago to today, I just want to suggest that none of it was inevitable. The internet that we have now was created by certain structural choices, and we can rethink them. And there are both industrial changes, inventors' choices, parents' choices, and regulatory choices that we can make to change our digital future. And I want to suggest that the internet that he imagined and that many of us experienced, especially in the early days, was very liberatory. And we suddenly had the world at our fingertips, and it felt like a huge, very free expanse. And the internet that many of us are feeling today is very confining, and we have a sense of digital dependency, that we are less free than we used to be. And I just want to say a few words about that dependency, what it consists of, how we got there, and how we might, again, think about freeing ourselves from it. So I think we feel dependent on these basically 2 or 3 platforms to deliver now for most of us, most of our news. We are dependent on clouds to store all of our content and our music, and we are subject to their rules, and sometimes we find content that we thought we had or owned disappearing, even treasured pieces of music or media content. We are dependent on navigation systems. We are dependent on search, and we don't know quite how it was served up to us and why the selections appear as they do, and that's going to become much worse as we all start using Alexa and voice search as opposed to word search, because then you just get one answer, so that makes these cognition problems, I assume, much more severe. We're going to be increasingly dependent on apps and increasingly concentrated apps just for basic services. Like, I don't know if you followed this story from San Francisco where public bathrooms are controlled by an app. So you've got to have your smartphone and you've got to have the app on your smartphone in order to get into the bathroom. And so these are not liberatory technologies in these contexts. So what were the structural choices that led us to this place? Well, some of them were decisions not to intervene, and I'm not talking about the layer of speech or even necessarily privacy, although decisions not to value individual privacy were important. But I think the main one is that, are 2 sources. One, we decided as a matter of public policy that there was no competition harm to having Facebook buy Instagram and Google buy DoubleClick, which is an ad-serving platform. And basically, we used antiquated antitrust standards to essentially allow these 2 companies to become the BMS that they are now, and to allow us, or to allow them to make us so dependent on them. Another sort of more geeky choice was to relieve these platforms of any liability that newspapers, for example, bear when they circulate defamatory content, also for hacks and breaches. So the most recent one, Facebook's, the breach of Facebook data, first of all, it only disclosed it as quickly as it did because the Europeans required that disclosure. The US government did not require that disclosure. And they are also, it's not really clear what their liability is for those kinds of security breaches. So those are a couple. There are many more we could go through, but those were conscious choices that we made over the past 20 years that brought us to this place. Now, in terms of solutions, I agree with both Maurice and Nima that, and Maggie, I think you have things to say about this too, that there are regulatory interventions that we should be considering. The problem is that these are not seatbelts because we are dealing with speech. And I think the next round of questions will talk about that. But I just wanted to throw out one small suggestion, which comes from the world of old media, which also dealt with speech. So we had all these same problems in a much more lower degree with television. But remember in the 90s when everyone was concerned about violence on television, and rather than require TV stations to do something about it, the government mandated that TV stations allow parents to do something, but they had to install technology, which was the V-chip. One thing I was just thinking of recently, and those of you who have teenage daughters will understand this. I don't think there are any teenage girls in the room, but these technologies like Instagram are designed to perfection to prey on teenage girls' self-image problems and low self-esteem. And so the way they do it is they have metrics, so if if you're a teenage girl, you will wonder, why did I have 300 likes yesterday and today I only have 200? What did I do wrong? What's wrong with me? Why does nobody like me? It's all about this number. So there's an app that can strip that number out of your results. You still have all the pictures and you have all the comments, but you just don't see that number. And you don't see your number of Twitter followers. So one teeny intervention would be, we could require all apps to just make available, all platforms to make available that kind of, it's a nudge, it's a psychological nudge to relieve teenagers, especially teenage girls, of that kind of pain. It's kind of like a V-chip. And I'll have more suggestions when we get to the next section.
Well, thank you very much. That was an excellent round. We really covered the waterfront in this very short time. We talked about both roles for the private sector, for entrepreneurs, for inventors, for parents, for educators, for technology, and for government. And I at least believe we need all of those and some. Now, to save time, we decided not to have 4 rounds. And we're going to take now, for the last round, 2 questions that are rather different, but we'll collapse them anyhow, and please indulge me. So one is the question we just heard, and that is there's a growing sense that Facebook and Google cannot hold to the position they are just platforms. They're just places where things get communicated, but not responsible for what's being communicated, that they're like publishers who have some duties to control what they publish. But when they do that, we jump all over them and say, you don't allow conservative voices. Why did you disallow this one? Why did you allow that one? And so I'd like you to, I grant you not an easy question. Would you role play for a moment and assume the unlikely event that Mark Zuckerberg wants to listen to you? So how do you tell him to get out of this box? And last, and again, granted a rather different subject, but if you allow us to move forward, is it true, and is it to be of evidence, that the internet is really destroying human connectiveness? Or does it provide a whole new place in which we connect each other? I often think about a single mother in Boston in the winter, which I experienced, and she has a 6th child, and she wants to interact with somebody. She cannot go to the neighborhood bar, but she can dial up her internet. So I'm not sure that we only lost connectiveness. Maybe we also got a new kind of connectiveness. Please.
I don't know. Okay, yeah, it's working. Yes, I think they are very highly interconnected. I think I'd like to flip the order and maybe not talk first about free speech, but about how this connectivity is both changing and I think being eroded. I think that we talked a little bit about the ideal of hyperconnectedness, the new sphere people talked about. Ever since the days of the telephone, these technologies would connect the entire world in effortless ways. And now, of course, we have a very new reality. And, I think there are two issues. One is the interruption, the siphoning, the dilution of the connections that we do have as human beings, both strong and weak. The second issue is the, setting forward, and sometimes in quite intention, in tension with the normal human connectivity, the setting up of new types of connections, both the online and then the relationship we increasingly have with the machine, with robots, with our devices themselves. And so just briefly, the idea, I was interviewing families recently about a new term called technoference. It's basically this disruption of togetherness, both couples and families, by devices. It's something everybody immediately understands. And some of the early research is pretty actually staggering, showing that higher levels of disruption and interruption of this togetherness, which is fairly rare anyhow, are related to more acting out on the part of the children, worse couple relationship satisfaction, more depression symptoms from mothers, and lower enjoyment when the device is being used in a setting like now. There's lower enjoyment of that event, even if it's a positive event, and more boredom. And this is true of family groups. And one study showed that 61% of mothers said that technology interferes with couples' time. 33% it said it does so at least for conversation once a day. I think we all know what this is talking about. So this kind of techno interference changes togetherness in really extreme ways. It's a togetherness that we need as humans. I mean, one of the core elements of human flourishing, if not the core, is belonging, is connectivity. People grow sick. People actually have higher mortality when they're lonely. It also shifts, this technoference shifts what is the third place, I think. This is, again, an unintended consequence, something I believe that we're just beginning to wake up to. The idea that we can now call in the order and not talk to the barista. The idea that when I'm a very directionally challenged person, and I live in New York City, which is pretty much a grid, but I can hardly make my way around, and I'm actually not even very good at reading maps, so I like to ask directions. And now people look at me as if I'm crazy. I have a phone, why aren't you using it? And I just found this incredible new research by a University of Virginia professor that talked about what's being lost when you don't ask directions. He gave people on a college campus directions to a new, unfamiliar building. Some took their phones, some didn't. Those who took their phones got there faster. They were more efficient, they were happier, and they had much, much less sense of social belonging and to their community. The ones with their phones, it was a little bit more difficult, but there's the ease and the efficiency that we value so much over everything today, over the unquantifiable. Just like so, are weak ties expendable? And is the third place not something that's really something we need anymore? I think that's really important. And finally, as far as the new type of relationships, which I think aren't zero-sum, but yet do clash. There are studies that show that time online takes away from face-to-face for younger people, which can lead to depression. I was just listening to a Yale professor on a panel the other night who said that one of the new longitudinal studies relating Facebook to depression is so strong that if we were talking about cigarettes, we would call it causal. It's a longitudinal correlational study, but it's so strong that we would say cigarette smoking caused cancer if there was the same kind of research. And so I think online, this context of social comparison, the minimalness, the stripping away of the biological cues that humans need to understand each other, the fact that it's prone to misunderstanding, and that's asynchronous so often makes it a very different type of relating. This is something that can't be ignored. And finally, I think maybe most interesting, but most on our horizon, is the relationship that we're having with the devices and the machinery. It's not just a part of the fabric of our life, a part of the ether, but it is something we are loving into itself. We're personifying. One study I found showed that a third of smartphone owners rated on scales of emotional closeness their device as close or closer to many of their friends. Far closer to grandparents, far closer than roommates and sports team members. And these were adults, they weren't just kids who were reading that. That's pretty a strong connection. And, again, while this is not zero sum, I think it's really worrisome, and a lot of technologists I know, scientists, roboticists, are extremely worried simply because humans are cheap dates. We are so easily both controlled, manipulated, and willing to fall in love with something with a couple of eyes and a little bit of skin. One researcher at Yale, has a robot named Nico, just retired, who plays rock, paper, scissors, and also card games with students. When 2 students played with the robot, and one student was called away out of the room, and the robot began to cheat, cheating that absent student, all it took for the robot to make the other student only 50% of the students told the other human being when they came back in the room that there had been cheating to begin with, but all it took for that reporting of cheating to fall to 0 was if the robot went or looked the person in the eye. I mean, we're really cheap dates. I just very quickly say that I think there's also good news. There are exciting studies that show that when people are given kind of perspective-taking inducements online, a day in the life of a minority, a day in the life of a Roma in Europe, person, those online cognitive perspective-taking inducements lowered bias for up to a year, not only for that minority, but for others like refugees. That's exciting. That can happen online. That can be a form of relationship building. The conformity that we tend to fall into so easily as humans also is being reversed or used in good, profitable ways. And by that I mean, if on Twitter a white supremacist is issuing messages of hate, and a person who's a white male, kind of within their in-group, but who opposes that hate, gives 1 or 2 messages saying, "Oh, come on, man, what are you doing?" or something even that subtle, then the messages go hate right down. So this sort of proactive, positive use of conformity can be really, and I haven't really talked about free speech, but yes, I'll pass it on there. But I think those are some of the relationship issues, I think.
Thank you.
So I think one lesson that we all learn at some point in our lives online kind of comes down to the internet is people. Sort of stealing that from an old movie line and repurposing it. But the internet really is people, and I think it's difficult to keep that in mind on a regular basis, and it takes some conscious effort to make sure that we do keep that in mind, because it's so easy to strip away the humanity when it's just text on a screen, when it's just an avatar on a screen, or maybe even just a photo on a screen. And we get such good feedback when a comment can go out and it is quickly reaffirmed, either in the positive or the negative, but we get such a hit of dopamine, of affirmation, that it keeps feeding on itself. And so I think that it's far easier to strip away the humanity and just reply to a comment or make a snide remark and get what we think are allies or get that affirmation at the expense of someone else, to the point that it really isn't even at the expense of someone else. It's at the expense of the text that's on the screen, or at the expense of a persona of someone that we think is at the other end receiving some of these comments. And that's where I think we have the biggest hurdle to overcome, is to see our hyper-connectedness as being connected to people, not just connected to accounts or followers or likes that we may or may not be accumulating. Because if we don't keep that in mind, it's hard to fall back on that feeling of empathy for other human beings, which I think we're all capable of, but we certainly need to practice at it, being able to feel and not only express. So for me, I think the social media platforms, they've done a very good job at connecting so many more people to one another, but there still is that sense that, outside of the people that we have the face-to-face physical relationship with, there's not that same level, that same quality of relationship with the people who we may not have had that physical interaction with in the past, so they almost become expendable or disposable. And that's the lesson that we're passing on. And I'm thinking about a podcast that I listened to recently where one of the guests was saying that his toddler, I believe his 2-year-old daughter, was being put down to bed, and he said goodnight, and she replied, like and subscribe. Right? Took me a second, and then we sort of got this chuckle, both on the podcast and then to myself there. I was thinking, oh yeah, that's what she's learning from watching so much YouTube. And I bet that anyone with small children, nieces or nephews like I have, you realize, yeah, they really are learning social cues. It's not just about the content, but it's actually the learning of how to interact with people, whether that be physically or digitally. Those lessons are being passed on, and I don't know how to correct for that. I don't know, what goes on in a toddler's brain when they're thinking that like and subscribe is a totally socially appropriate way of saying good night or even goodbye, but it makes sense. I don't know how many more times they need to hear good night means good night, or if they would even be able to change that behavior because it is learned at such an early age. It is shaping their outlook on life. How do we correct some of these inappropriate behaviors that are learned at such an early age? And that's where my concern about the hyper-connectedness comes in, is that we as humans we aren't very good with dealing with a large number of humans within our networks. And so can we rewire ourselves culturally and socially to become more accustomed to that and have that empathy built into the fabric of our social networks, literally and figuratively speaking?
Maybe we want to hear what you tell to Facebook.
Oh, what would I say to Facebook? Well, I would say the same thing I'd say to any other platform or anyone else for that matter, which is enforce your rules. Just simply enforce your rules. If you're going to have a code of conduct, enforce the rules. If there's going to be a reporting mechanism, make sure that people feel like their voice is being heard. If someone comes across something on the platform they find objectionable or is outright threatening, they should feel confident that what they're experiencing can be reported up to the people who control the platform and that the issue will be resolved. Now, resolution may not mean that content is taken down. It might be a reply saying, yes, this falls within the rules of our community, but communities are all based upon rules, and without those rules, it falls apart. I think the biggest test for all of these social platforms is the Trump exception, right? I think that any social platform that has an obvious outlier needs to make the decision and really communicate it well that if the rules don't apply to everyone, why don't those rules apply, and what is that threshold? We can talk about Twitter. Twitter has taken people off of their platform, both those with a few followers, those with millions of followers, but there is an outlier that is obviously breaking the rules, breaking the code of conduct. Twitter set the rules. Twitter is not enforcing the rules. How are we as a community going to deal with that? Are we going to punish the folks that make the rules? It doesn't look like it. It's certainly benefiting some people to see the rules being broken because that break in the rules is going in their favor. It is allowing them to hear certain kinds of speech that they agree with. It is also allowing them to see the suppression of certain speech that they don't agree with. And that speech in and of itself may fall within the rules, so it should be allowed. And so I think that that is a bigger issue for these social platforms, for the executives, to be able to stand up, confidently communicate, these are our rules, these are how they're going to be reinforced, and these are clearly the punishments, and those have to be exacted in a way that is consistent with the rules. Otherwise, the only lesson that people are learning is that the rules don't apply to everyone. And the surest way to make sure that the rules don't apply to you are to become popular.
So I guess to take the questions in order, following up on the censorship point, I guess my answer, or what I would tell Mark Zuckerberg, is to get out of the business of censorship. And the reason I say that is because a lot of these social media platforms are not altruistic actors. We can't, quite frankly, I don't trust them to make decisions that are not driven necessarily by profit or by political influence. And they're not very good at censorship. And when I say they're not very good at it, I mean they're not very good at applying it equitably. I'll give you a couple of examples. So we know there were some cases where individuals were attempting to live stream police brutality. Those were taken off of Facebook. There was a case where the same exact content, when posted by an African American woman, was taken down and her account was deactivated. Thinking that something might be wrong and thinking that it was odd, she asked her white friends to post the same content, and nothing happened. And so I think when we talk about these platforms and we talk about censorship, we have to recognize that they are going to be influenced by many of the same things that exist in society, by power, by race, by class. And I quite frankly don't trust Facebook or Twitter or a lot of these companies to always make the right decision. Now, when I'm saying that, do I mean that we don't need to do things in society to address racism, to address hate, to address other issues? Of course we need to. I just don't think that this is the solution. The solution is much more complicated. The solution means addressing structural issues within our society that are not as easy as clicking a button and having a Facebook post come down. So I guess that's what I would say to Mark Zuckerberg. I think on the broader connectivity point, to me, the internet has been really awesome with connectivity in certain ways, right? You see activists finding each other. You see parents whose child have rare diseases able to reach out to other parents. So I think that one thing that the internet has been good at is giving people the ability to find people like them, right? Because you seek those people out. I think that one of the things that it is not necessarily great at is connecting people or forcing people who are different and disagree into the same room. I'll give you an example from my own life. If I'm going through my Facebook feed, right, and the Kavanaugh nomination was something that I felt very strongly about. If I saw a post from somebody who disagreed, so often I was just like, you know what, I'm going to silence this person. I'm not going to look at it. I just don't feel like it. This is what I feel. I'm not in the mood to read this today. I had to have that conversation with an acquaintance of mine, and I couldn't just shut him off. I wish I had had a mute button. I didn't have a mute button, right? I actually had to sit and have the conversation. And so I think the solution to this, the internet feeding you what you want to hear and want to see, is deliberately seeking out the opposite. I done an experiment where instead of reading the newspaper I normally read, I read all the newspapers I hate to read, right, to see what they're saying about the same issue. Deliberately seeking out individuals who might be different from you. And so I think that that's something we as humans can do when we understand that we're sort of in a bubble and we've been captured in our bubble, and it's becoming harder for us to understand the opposite point of view and to have a rational, calm discussion with the opposite point of view.
Okay, well, if we could ask the audience a question, I would ask, what's the difference between censorship and editorial responsibility? Because it's when we don't like it, we call it censorship, and when we like it, we call it editorial responsibility. There is maybe some meaning we can give to the word censorship, which is it has to do with power. So the only reason we talk about Facebook or Zuckerberg when he takes down, Alex Jones, and then Alex Jones screams that he's censoring him is because Facebook has all this power, and it just shouldn't have all that power. It just shouldn't matter that much who Facebook takes down because there are alternatives. So I would suggest to Mark Zuckerberg that he become a B corporation or a nonprofit and have different motivations. He spin off some of his business, or he, submit and don't lobby against government efforts to create more competition. So again, I think a lot of this is structural. With respect to, again, what we call censorship, I mean, to Nima's point, I don't think there's any way that they can avoid censoring if we understand that concept broadly, because they are making choices about what surfaces on our feeds and what surfaces in our searches in ways that we don't understand and can't know and are not transparent to us. So, for example, the platforms make the choice to reward us for being with like-minded people, or to accommodate our desire to mute voices we don't want to hear. It doesn't have to be that way. That's just what's most revenue-producing for them. They make choices based on behavioral advertising and the way advertising is served to push us to ever more extreme positions. So if you've seen Zeynep Tufekci's research, you start out as a vegetarian looking for vegetarian content, and you end up with vegan content. You start out being interested in 10K races, and you're into ultra marathons, because that's just where that's the content that is stickier and that keeps you on the platform longer. They don't have to organize these platforms to maximize time spent, but that's what's most revenue producing. So as a result, it produces the Alex Jones. So then there's the question of, do we take Alex Jones off? But there's a prior question about who gets to be that popular in the first place. So, the censorship question is incredibly tricky because they don't do it well, because even if they wanted to, they won't do it consistently. And I think, and maybe because I do First Amendment law and I'm sensitive, like Nima is to the to government regulation in this area, a couple of sort of maybe perhaps less satisfying fixes, but constitutional ones that we might consider would be requiring more transparency about how these platforms do make their decisions about taking down accounts, or even about elevating certain kinds of speech. So if you look at Facebook's transparency report, where they do talk about how they have enforced their terms of service, it's in the most general and sort of opaque ways, and I think if it were more detailed, we might feel more satisfied, at least understand or have a better claim of discriminatory treatment if that existed. And then the second sort of small fix would be more due process, so that if you are taken down for whatever reason, there's a clear procedure. And this is only because they have so much power. If they didn't have so much power, I don't think this would be necessary. But because they are sitting kind of like a government, that we should have sort of the rights that citizens do with respect to the government to go petition Facebook and figure out and have some recourse if we thought we were taken down unfairly.
Well, this was excellent beginning for more discussion with you. So on the connectiveness, let me just say, the jury is still out. We may find that there's some loss on one hand and some gain on the other hand, like connecting the activists. Or I like to think about a young gay person in the Deep South who cannot talk about to anybody, but can go on the internet and find others. I like also to make a minor technical point. If you look at the studies which compare human connectiveness to screen time, they automatically assume that anytime you look at the screen, you're just studying something, you're Googling, not interacting. So they don't count that is a possible connectiveness. And they disregard that the average American used to watch television 6 hours a day. So maybe some of what we're losing is not human connectiveness, but television watching time. Anyhow, that's for another day. As to Mr. Zuckerberg, we obviously haven't solved that issue today. So we're going to have a whole other session, a whole evening devoted only to that question. I hope you all come back and join us. It's your time now. There are microphones on both sides, so please join the conversation.
Thank you for a very stimulating panel. My name is Dalton Conley. About 10 years. I don't know. Oh, there it goes. My name is Dalton Conley, and about 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Elsewhere USA, connecting the changes in the economy, rising inequality, with the sort of constant connectivity, and argued that a lot of traditionally modernist boundaries were eroding as a result of that confluence. For example, home and work used to be two distinct spheres. Now they're not. Even leisure and work, investment and consumption, and so forth. So I'm kind of on your side with your concerns, but this was supposed to be a debate. So now all I'm hearing about the good side of everything is from Amitai. So I want to throw out some more sort of trends or facts that I would like to hear your response to. So with respect to kids, today's adolescents use drugs and alcohol at the lowest rates. I think my adolescence was the highest rates since I think the 50s or 60s. Crime is still at its lowest rates since, again, the early 1960s. I don't think we've talked about the fact that because kids are at home on screens, they're not out doing bad things or getting mugged or beat up. To take your example of the robot, I think that's colluding with the subject to lie. I think that's actually good evidence that we're not losing the ability to empathize or to have kind of secret communication and understand cues, social cues. If anything, we're getting tricked by a robot, or we're feeling that so much that we're kind of attributing, anthropomorphizing a robot and interacting with a robot. But so I think there's concerns, but I haven't heard anybody sort of again, other than Amitai's gay closeted person in the South, or the lonely single mother in Boston, about the kind of positive aspects of the current lay of the land, the current information ecology. So if someone could, from the panel, talk about kind of what's good now, let's say for kids growing up versus my childhood.
Mr. Rogers. Anybody?
I mean, it's friggin' amazing. You can get on to Google or Wikipedia and find out the answer to anything. And it may short circuit cognition, but it also feeds interests and sparks exploration. And so that's one obvious one.
Yeah, I would just say, however, that I'm very much more concerned about the challenges. I think we know the good things, and I think it's important to remind ourselves, and I celebrate it, and I use it. We all do. I mean, I think we're more picky and choosy about what we use, which technologies we use. But I think that crime might be going down, and yet depression is a global epidemic, anxiety. I mean, these are really, I think it's really important to wake up to the challenges that we haven't been waking up to. We've performed a kind of grand social experiment on not just the kids, but ourselves. And so I entirely celebrate the great accessibility. It's the worry I have that access doesn't lead to understanding, and that the unthinking nature of what I see all around us in terms of both incivility and inability to kind of go deeply into problems. I mean, this is something I think which is really important. I mean, Steven Pinker has the great book on the Enlightenment now, you know, talking about all the positives. And again, it's very true, you know, crime, health, economic growth. But I'd also have to push back and say that, you know, one of the main findings in terms of the great outgrowth of research into flourishing, human flourishing, is that happiness and GDP aren't the measures that we need to use. We need to have a more expansive understanding of what human flourishing is to encapsulate some of these invisibles and perhaps unquantifiables.
Yeah, but on the microphone.
Sort of piece of evidence. I'm sure you're all familiar with the marshmallow test about kids being able to resist impulse to get a deferred reward. One of the big concerns about kids and technology is that it's eroding their ability to control impulses, to delay gratification, to work through something hard. But actually, a meta-analysis has shown that kids' ability to pass the marshmallow test and last for longer has been steadily increasing over the last 20 years. So
Yeah,
I just think it's our reflexive concerns. I mean, I'm glad we all have concerns, but we have to look more closely at the data, whether it's correlation and not causation.
I completely agree. I still think that that can be right, and the concerns can be absolutely urgent, alarming. That research, I know the scientist who just came out with that, it was done with high echelon, high economic, you know, studies. The idea that kids can wait longer partly has to do with the kind of schooling they're giving, the lack of free time and playtime they're given, and it's not happening. You know, it's a certain segment of society that had that. So, I mean, again, I really, I love it all too, but I think it's really important to wake up to the concerns.
I have no problem with that study. I hate marshmallows.
Okay, I'd like to discuss something that you said. I don't necessarily agree with you that crime has gone down. We have huge cyber crime. We have identity theft, which is much easier with the cyber connectedness. We have cyber bullying when kids are on their screens. So I don't agree with what you said.
I can respond to that a little bit too. I'll give two positives and a negative positive. I think the folks in the accessibility community are probably benefiting a great deal more than what is typically going on in the conversation. Folks that might be physically or mentally challenged are finding a great deal of advantage when it comes to using technologies to be and stay independent, and I don't think that gets enough credit. We all, or most of us, have devices in our pockets, our smartphones, that have incredible accessibility functionality that many people will never know about and never need, but the folks that can take advantage of that find it truly life-saving to be able to walk around with the phone and simply point the camera at the outside world that, if they cannot see it, describes the world to them, or allows them to have interactions that they otherwise would not have had. And I think that is a tremendous benefit that technology offers. I'll go back to the negative. I think on the illegal drug use being down, I think that there's probably a counter to that, which would be that the prescription drug use is up. So why would you need to abuse illegal drugs when you're just diagnosed with ADD when you're in kindergarten or first grade, and you just keep that prescription throughout high school and then into adulthood and maybe transition into other drug use. So I'll cut it off there.
I guess it kind of shows that you can find a statistic to prove whatever you want. Okay? I wasn't finished.
No, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I want to ask a question, but I was just commenting on the fact that you can come up with.
But I had a question.
Okay. The challenges that you talk a lot about, I want to share with you. I have a 2-year-old great-grandson. And as he's with me, he wants to read a book. It's called Charlie Parker Played Bebop. And as a 2-year-old, I mean, you know, we've gone over the book 10 times, 20 times, and he almost knows what's on the pages. Take him over to his other grandmother's house, and his sister's playing with a tablet. And he goes in, he takes the tablet. You're macho, or, you know, when you were concerned about what happens to the girls. I mean, boys have problems too. So his sister cries, and his grandmother says, go get the cell phone. So she goes get the cell phone, and he takes the cell phone, and he, I mean, you know, at 2 years old, these are his tendencies. Now, my fear is that he won't really want to read because he's so entertained. And the stimulation from the YouTubes and all of that is so much more overwhelming than a book. Now, there's no study that's going to really capture that, because we're looking at these studies, and the studies are typically funded by the technology companies who want the good things to show up, but you don't see that unintended consequence. Therefore, it's not measured.
Thank you very much.
I wasn't finished. But see, I mean, and again, that just shows how...
You paused, so you misled me.
Well, but that's, again, what my grandson's going to have to worry about, because in reading, you pause. Okay, but with the cell phone or with these technologies, you have instant stimulation. You're already an example of the negative consequence that I'm referring to. So how, I mean, you know, that lack of, or that loss of humanness, just example for that. How do we deal with that? As you've looked at, like I say, most of the studies that probably come back are the ones that are going to glamify or glorify the benefits of it.
Okay, can we answer now?
Please.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So I'll not give you not only a chance to answer that, but let's focus now for a moment only on solutions, small and big. So, for instance, in France, there's a law which does not allow employers to send emails after work hours. You know, some people announce that they will not respond to emails during the weekend to recreate the Sabbath. So now, these are not big structural solutions like, you know, telling Zuckerberg to sell his company and become not-for-profit tomorrow. But as we respond to the question we just asked, small and big solutions, no more analysis.
Well, you know, I think we've been talking a lot about solutions. You know, the idea of accountability on inventors, the guidelines that are coming out. You know, asking people to include ethical decisions in AI and robotics. The transparency, calls for transparency. I think that's really important. You know, I think that these are, I would reiterate the need for a bigger push toward deliberative type of learning from information literacy. You know, the move away from, you know, just focusing narrowly on sourcing. One interesting, small, but I think really important solution speaks to the idea of the cognitive narrowing. We're talking about social types of narrowing to, you know, to the echo chamber type of news, the idea that we're hanging in silos of our own kind of mirror-like imagery online. And that's true cognitively as well in many ways, because new research is showing that in terms of science, when research is put online, for every year of a journal that's placed online, the number of distinct articles cited drops 14%. So what happens is that what's most popular and therefore most prevailing in the scientific literature is also what is seen and used, so that causes problems, so that scientists, say in genetics, are now actually just focusing on the same few genes that have been studied for the last decades, and that we know the human genome, but we're not taking advantage of so the NIH has just, in the last month, started a very, very, very tiny, I'm kind of a drop in the bucket in the Niagara Falls of this problem, but a specific initiative to fund work on unknown genes, the genes that have never had a scientific paper published on them. And they're literally starting with 7 researchers, but that's enormously important because that shows an understanding of the problem and a way to push people into the unknown. Because a lot of what we're talking about is fear-based society, clinging to the familiar, clinging to what's known, clinging to what's like us.
Solutions. So,
That's a solution.
Can I wait? I just want to address this gentleman's
please do.
question, because I have the same lament, and I'll just tell you what people tell me, which is that people thought the same thing with radio, that when TV came along we'd lose radio, or when either of them came along we'd lose books, and we didn't, and or when recordings came along that we'd lose sheet music, right, and singing, and we didn't. They've all existed side by side, and so probably books will make it, but it's also possible that books will radically change, and they'll become kind of multimedia artifacts, and so a little bit of, I think, our lament is kind of adjusting to a future where human relationships are really different, and the things, these media artifacts change a lot. And I also wanted to respond to Dalton. What your question made me think of, all these technologies are good and bad, right? And so, and just looking at all these cars go by, I'm thinking about autonomous vehicles and all their promise that they're going to bring us in terms of freedom and energy savings and reduction in accidents, and also that we're scared to death about the ethical choices that they're going to make, and the who is the economic consequences that they will have. And I think one of the things that you're hearing from this panel, maybe a little bit less, it's all doom and gloom, but just that we're at this inflection point where we want more control and more say. We kind of want these sort of panels to decide what we want, what data we want to be collected, how we want this to move forward.
Solutions. I'm pretty much a straightforward guy. I think we need to have a comprehensive digital literacy program start in preschool and kindergarten and continue on through 12th grade. People shouldn't be getting basic cybersecurity hygiene lessons at their first job when they're 24, 25 years old. I think if we start when people start using these devices, we can build a curriculum on a base of how do you as an individual act safely in an environment, and then it grows into how do you as an individual act responsibly within an ecosystem of that environment. It needs to be the digital equivalence of wash your hands after you use the restroom, look both ways before you cross the street, stop, drop, and roll if you're on fire. These are the things that kids need to learn at a very early age so they can learn to appreciate their role in making sure that they keep themselves safe and that they keep their fellow community members safe. And without that, we're going to continue to have a very difficult time showing just how much value this internet ecosystem has and how much value we all have when we are within it, and the destructive power that we have when we are in it.
I was just going to say, along those same lines, I think in terms of solutions, one is as part of that kind of literacy, teaching kids to understand, how to tell what they should trust on the internet versus not trust, right? I think that's part of the disinformation conversation we were having before. And I also think that we need to address the fact that technology isn't impacting all segments of society equally, right? There are parts of the country where broadband and infrastructure is not available to the same sense. And so I do think that one of the, you talk about the good things of technology, my hope is that it would be an equalizer, right? And it hasn't worked out that way always. And so I do think that some of that infrastructure should be something that we think about, making sure that all communities have access to technology in the same way, so we don't see these inconsistencies between sort of the have and have-nots.
As a quick follow-up on that, I graduated high school in 1997, and so when I started high school in 93, my high school was brand new. It was one of the first in the country to actually have fiber optic cables throughout the entire facility. We had broadband, we had TV access, we had computers. And so I've basically grown up with broadband internet for more than half my life. And there are still people in this country who don't have even the level of broadband access that I had in the mid-90s. And I think that's a shame, and that is a failure of our federal government in making sure that everyone has access to these technologies.
All right, last question. So let's go back to...
Right. I think you kind of touched on this. My name is Charles Acree, and I'm in technology. But my question is one of individual, group, and community cooperation, which I think you have addressed, but it deals with the concept of well-being. I think we've already identified from listening to you that there are different ways of looking at well-being, but do any of you have a suggestion for individuals, families, or communities to look at how they can help assist others in finding well-being, not just for themselves, but for those who are different from themselves, so that we can cooperate better as a community?
Thank you.
Well, now, I just wondered, did you mean digital well-being or well-being on a whole? Any kind of well-being?
One of the things I've been kind of hearing is that people tend to separate well-being when they're looking at technology and well-being when they're looking at people, when it's really the same. We might get to it a different way, but just because you're going through a tool to identify how you feel or what your point of view is, you're still the person that has some degree of well-being and you consider true for yourself, and the question is, do you consider it to be true for others? Or is it so different that others consider what you consider to be well-being harmful to them? And then how do you bring those two together in a way that you can see well-being across the board? So I'm looking at technology as just a median, not necessarily a determining factor.
Anybody in the panel?
Well, I think I did mention really briefly, but I think it's really important and interesting that there has been this, rise in interest in well-being that's, measured or understood beyond mere happiness or mere GDP. So the expansion of the notion of well-being is really important. I also think it's really important to understand it in a non-static, in a kind of dynamic fashion across the lifespan, because well-being can be often just quantified in a one specialized way. But I think that it's really a dynamic process, and I'm not sure that I know that how anyone is talking about that, but it seems really important that it changes, and so it has to have a fluidity and flexibility. There's also a lot of work now on both subjective and objective well-being measures, so that the idea of whether you feel your life is satisfying or whether your longevity is dropping, as it is in the United States, those are two different things, but both very important.
Yeah, that's really an important point for us to take with us, because the subject of our session was well-being, and indeed we moved from notion of simple happiness to, as you said, first to subjective well-being as a broader concept, and now to objective idea that we measure how much income you have and how good is your health, so to get us some other measures than simply did you smile on Mondays, Well, we have room for a very short one more round, as you know, other people at the microphones. So let's just really focus on that question, the silo question. So here you have people who watch only Fox, and here you have people who watch only MSNBC, and we all agree it would be nice if the once in a while hurt the other side. What are you going to do about that? You're not going to go home unless you answer that question.
What am I going to do about it? I mean, there have been a lot of interesting proposals that are. This is not a new problem, and we used to have something called the Fairness Doctrine, which required broadcast stations to air opposing viewpoints on controversial issues. And the same things have been proposed for online fora, that they would have to, have a link or a flag or side-by-sides of opposing viewpoints. So that would be a possibility, but I think probably a better idea would be, to start programming, and this again goes to the business model, to start surfacing and making it advantageous for advertisers to support this, surfacing alternative viewpoints when people are spending their time online.
I think probably the twofold solution I can think of. One is people acknowledging this is a problem and forcing themselves to read other content, right? That's all within our power. I can go to Fox News if I want to. It's just a lot of people often don't seek out that other viewpoint. The other, I think, is probably a more complex solution, but I think often when we're seeing these divisions, whether it's in politics, the fault lines are really race or socioeconomic status. A lot of these other factors that often lead to, I think, broader segregation in society. So I can think of, there has to be places where we overcome that segregation, whether it's self-segregation or whether it's a product of class and race. And, I think of my own upbringing. I didn't go to a local high school. I went to a school where we were bused. And so as a result of that, my high school looked like the United Nations, right? There was probably 30 to 40% African American, 20 to 30% Latino. There was, every Asian represented. There was also a white population. I don't think most people had that same experience growing up, and it was because I was sort of put into this place where there was a forced equalizing, so to speak. And I do think that we need more places in our country where there is that forced equalizing, because it's really relationships and people. We can talk about technology all day, but well-being is often going to be the function of a lot of other things.
And at this point, we are about to read a conclusion, but before we proceed, the light is my face. I don't see. Is Sky Lindbergh here? Yeah. So behind this meeting is really a force. And without Sky, we would not be here. So would you all help me thank Sky for all the good work she did. And thank you all for coming. Next month, we're going to meet right here to discuss the question, what makes America great? And I hope you all join. And I've been asked you to remind you that Maggie Jackson is available to sign her book if you buy it first. And let me now ask you to help me thank the panel for what was truly an excellent discussion.